Speech 4. In October 2014, the district superintendent, Dr. Doug Pennington, approached Reverend Dave Rhodes about applying to the annual conference Office of Congregational Development to join the Antioch Project. Brother David never heard of the Antioch Project before, so he asked Doug to explain what all did this mean. It was explained that the Antioch Project was a new initiative of the annual conference to help churches that were on an attendance and a membership plateau but had great potential. Help would be given by the conference so that the church could reach their potential. In January 2015, Brother Dave made the application to the Director of Congregational Development, Reverend Dan Pizzette. When we began the research phase of the Antioch Project, a history of the attendance and the membership of the church for the past 40 years was compiled, as well as history of the city of Chickasaw. We had 3 focused prayer experiences during 2015 to prepare our church for the undertaking. Then on February 19th through the 21st of 2016, the church hosted Dan Pizzette, Doug Pennington, and Herb Sadler as consultants for our Barnabas weekend. On Sunday, February 21st, Dan Pizzette gave us 5 recommendations. The plan for the Barnabas Project was to accept the recommendations and move forward with the Antioch plan. Then we would have 5 coaches assigned to us so we could apply these recommendations. On Sunday, April 3rd, 2016, we held a church conference and a vote to choose whether we wanted to move ahead with our Antioch recommendations. We voted by paper ballots, and the yes votes were well above the 70% majority that was needed. We accepted the recommendations of reestablishing the mission and vision for our church, work to create a culture of hospitality in our church, initiated ministries to work toward reaching the next generation for Christ, discern the greatest needs of our community, and work to do focused outreach to meet the needs, and to organize to create a number of new small groups in and outside of the church. Can you believe it's been over 2 years since we started work on these recommendations? We have worked to receive and apply the guidance of 3 of the coaches so far. We're getting started with the work of outreach with the newest coach, Reverend Bryce Early. We've seen the growth in a number of areas of our church. It has been an exciting 2.5 years, but we believe with God, the best is yet to come. Then, after all that positive about the future, let's talk about grief. In the last 6 years, I spoke on grief twice, most recently back in November. I had a lot of positive feedback from that message, so I chose to revisit this topic again by looking together at the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is a unique book in the Bible. One, because it's named after a woman. The other book in the Bible named after a woman is Esther. I know it was the culture of the time. I think there's some other books should have been named after women. I think the book of Judges should be the book of Deborah and lesser known heroes. But I wasn't around and they would have asked me anyway. But we're going to look at Ruth because it is a story of grief, but it is also a powerful story of the providence and the provision of God during a time of hardship. And I titled the message, God in Your Pain and Grief. Maybe a better way to say it is that finding God, knowing God in your pain and your grief. As we think about grief, grief is the process one goes through as we adjust ourselves in our life after a major significant loss, most notably the death of a loved one, a friend, someone close to you, but also other things cause grief, loss of a job, loss of a station in life. I've had some people tell me that after they retired, they grieved. Some of you are looking at me like, I want to try that. Well, I want to try it. Another major grief is divorce. I mean, marriage is a major change, and to leave a marriage is a major change. So let's think about grief, because grief involves loss, but it is a healing process that God has set into us, built into us, to help us heal and adjust and recover after significant losses come to our life. Let me say this, that people do grieve differently. We have to accept that and realize that. I've seen stories, I could tell you several, of where God is, and let me just say, I appreciate God for giving me the privilege as a pastor of walking with people through loss and through grief. And I've seen people process it very differently. Yeah, some people don't process it too well, but even those who process it well, they do it differently. And we need to accept that and appreciate that. So let's look together to God's Word, looking to the first chapter of the first verses in the book of Ruth. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab to live there. Back then, and not that long ago, during times of famine, changes in weather, people moved around. The Rhodeses left the Rhodeses and the Stonells left Galveston in 1900 after a hurricane, and they headed east, and look, we're still here in the east. That's how my family wound up here. It was common to move around when the weather changed or it got difficult. Now, back to verse 8. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. The word is Orpah, not Ophrah. Thank you for the 5 who laughed. Okay. After they had lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons, without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of the people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home there. Things got better in Bethlehem. Time to go back. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take her back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and me. May the Lord grant each of you that you may find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them and said goodbye, and they wept aloud. And they said, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband." So they are in a time of famine, and they move to another part of that world, and they set out to restart their lives. The sons get married, and interestingly, all the men in the family die. Great hardship comes upon this family. Now, as a pastor, I've had the privilege of being a part with families and people with a number of losses. I've done funerals for a wide range of situations. I've done funerals for teenagers, for children, for young adults. Youngest, I once did a funeral for a 6-month-old baby, and that's something stays with you the rest of your life. And I've done funerals for some very well-seasoned saints of God who had walked with the Lord many years, and it was a glorious homecoming. But through those times of working with people, sometimes people ask me the question, why? Why did this happen? Why did God make this happen? Why did God allow this happen? And I've wrestled with that question with a number of people that I love and appreciate. And I've come to what sounds like a glib, but it's a serious conclusion myself, that grief and loss happen to good people and bad people. I really don't have an answer to why did it happen this way. I've seen grief and loss happen to good people. I've seen it happen to bad people. I've seen really good things happen to good people. I've seen good things happen to some really selfish people. It seems to be the nature. I think the bigger question, though, is what can God do for me right now? Or maybe a better way to put that question is, how can I encounter God now in the situation I'm in at this place? I think a lot of times the losses that we experience are a reflection of the place and the time we're alive. As much as anything, I don't want to sound too cold and stoic here, but I've thought a lot about this. The first church I served, Chickasaw United Methodist Church, about 60, 70 people on Sundays. So that's about a group of 120 people. And of that group of 120 people, 5 of the families lost someone in World War II. 5 of the people had a death in World War II, someone killed in the war. That's a very high number for just 120 people. Well, one thing that was caused by was the people were tied to the land. They'd been on that land since the 1930s, and most of them, I could go and drive you to each of their places. They're still there. They don't move around. So because they don't move around, we know more history. And that was a time where there was a terrible war going on, and a lot of good people got killed. And that was just where the time and place they were alive. Or talking to Davis and his experience, and my son Davis, his experience as a missionary in Tanzania, it is shocking to me that almost every family he knows has a child that has died from malaria. A few of us have lost children, not very many, and none of us have lost children in malaria. It's a result of where they are and the time they are. I'm excited about those from our church that are going on this trip to Haiti to try to bring help, medical help, in a medically challenged part of the world in Haiti. So why did this happen to Naomi? I really don't know. But she's having a really difficult time. Let's keep moving into this. Picking up with verse 12. Naomi speaking to her daughter-in-law, Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I have a husband tonight and give birth to 2 sons, would you wait until they grow up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. And they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. But Ruth replied, Look, Naomi said, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. You go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you from me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred with excitement because of them. The women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Lord Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? Can you see the picture? A homecoming of an old friend that's been gone for a number of years. And you're all excited to see the person. And what do? You call them by their name, right? And that's what it's Naomi. Naomi's back. Can't you see him say, give me a hug? And Naomi's saying, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because I am bitter. I'm sure it was a shock. It's one thing to have difficult feelings inside yourself. It's another thing where you say, I need a name change. I'm so bitter. But that is what she was saying. She wants to be alone because she is sad. She is in a time of grief. But the truth is, we need each other during times of grief. And I did some work on this week. Why do we want to be alone when we're in a time of grief? Number one, we're depressed. And when you're depressed, your emotional energy is low, and to be around people demands that you have a certain amount of emotional energy. and when you feel the tank is already low, you're not wanting to use it up. Number two, when you lose someone or something very important to you, you feel disoriented. You're having a difficult time with yourself, and you don't want to add new people to the mix. And number three, it is a struggle at times. I don't want to sound too critical, but I've experienced this. Others have told me about this too, where you're not always sure if you want to be around people if they say things to you don't know how to respond to. You don't want people to tell you how you're supposed to feel. C.S. Lewis wrote a famous book on grief after his wife died called A Grief Observed, and I thought this was the most telling paragraph in the whole book, where he talks about where he got where he didn't want people to talk to him because they would come up and say things to him that he couldn't really feel and relate to and make him mad. But at the same time, he said, I was mad at the people who were avoiding me. For avoiding me. Why are they avoiding me? And then he said, the people I grew to love were the people that came up to me and went and walked off. Because they didn't know what to say, but they said, I care. I think all we need to communicate is I care. And I'm sorry. When I was home on a Christmas break, I think it was my third year of college, a guy I played YMCA football with, John Owens, died in a car wreck. And I went to, his father was the coach of that football team, so I went to the viewing that night. And I went up to his dad and I said, hey, Mr. Owens, how are you doing? And he cried and said, not very good, and I cried too. And for a few years after that, I felt really stupid because I didn't know what to say in that situation. But as I played back that experience, it was about as good as you can do. I said I cared. He said he was sad, and we were sad together. We carried each other burdens in this situation. Now, Naomi wants to be alone, but for some reason, Ruth knows better. Ruth has faith, while Naomi has bitterness, and she pushes the issue and says, I see something in your God, see something in your faith. And Naomi's like, it's not there. But Ruth says, yes, it is there, and I want to be a part of that. She invited herself into the other person's world because she saw they needed each other, and they did. Remember, some of you know Perry Matthews, lives over on 2nd Street, was our police chief. His mother, Jeanette, worked for my grandfather when I was in high school, and I worked there in the summers. And Jeanette had one of the most romantic husbands in the world. He was so good. He would stop by on his lunch break, walk the 100 yards from the street to the building, give her a kiss, and get back in his car and leave. He was amazing. And one day when Jeanette wasn't there, one of the other ladies that worked in that building said, I still miss him coming and giving her a kiss at lunch. That's so sad. And he had died in that year between the summers. I wasn't there. And in my 17-year-old arrogance, I said, I don't think losing somebody's going to ever bother me. And my 17-year-old arrogance, I said that. And thankfully, one of the nice ladies there said, well, Dave, you just hadn't lost anybody yet. You'll see one day. And it was within a year my grandfather died, and I really realized how disorienting and difficult it is to lose somebody important to you. And one of the things I did to recover from my grief was I've been a college student, would come home at times and let my grandmother fix me lunch. Man, that woman could cook. And we would, after lunch, sit down and talk about Papa Roy, my grandfather. And then when I remember driving home thinking, I feel better. I don't know why, but I feel better. Because I was grieving with another person. Let me just say this, as we all at times struggle with depression. It shows itself in different ways, but depression is best cured by loving people. Galatians 6:2, carry each other's burdens in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Yeah, I know we've got some great medicines that help with depression, and I thank the Lord for that. And there's certain things people can do and that or not do that help. I had a friend in seminary who said his depression was better when he didn't listen to country western music. No extra charge for that. I'll let you make up your mind, but he did swear that that helped his emotional state. But when you're depressed, friends, or when I'm depressed, what you need to do is pick up that phone and make a call. Text somebody, write a little note to tell somebody you're thinking about them and you love them and you appreciate them and how they've been a blessing to your life. Like Gary invited us to do, take a few minutes and just thank God for what he's given you. Depression is, and this is not negative, stay with me on this, don't tune me out. Depression is a self-orienting problem. It makes you think about yourself. And the way out of it is to think about others. And find your way out by serving others. That's not the same. It's just staying busy. You can't run from sadness. It will get you. But make that step to love somebody else. Find somebody. Don't stay trapped in your own depression. Find someone to serve or some group of people to serve, some way to actively serve, not to make people tell you you're great, just serve. The very act of serving gets your mind off yourself and lifts your spirit. I am a practitioner of that. I encourage you to do it. Now, as you go through grief, for people close to you going to grief, see this in families, I want to encourage you to be patient with people as they go through grief. Naomi's husband died. Ruth's husband has died. Are you following the story? They're both widows. They're both widows in grief. But they process their grief differently, and I really appreciate Ruth for how she was able to be patient with Naomi, even though her grief was having a different effect with her. Naomi was bitter. Ruth had faith. We'll look at that in just a minute. But there is this thing called the stages of grief. This brilliant woman, Elizabeth Kuhlman Ross, wrote a book on death and dying back in the 60s, and it kind of became she became the great-grandmother of the grief understanding process, and she wrote about the 5 stages of grief. It's in your bulletin there. It's been expanded, I think, up to 19, but I like the simplest 5 stages that come to us in grief. And I wrote them like as a straight line. Doesn't mean they have to go in this order. You can go and then back up. You can jump steps. You can all of a sudden think you're all over something, and all of a sudden you find yourself back in the beginning again. Stage 1, denial. I mentioned my grandfather dying when I was 17. I was so mad at some of my family members because they stopped talking about my grandfather. They began to deny he existed. Well, it wasn't they denied it existed. They were in denial because a major loss had happened. You began to disassociate yourself from that situation. If you've ever been around someone who has a very sudden loss, many times that person will tell the same story over and over and over again. What are they doing? They're trying to convince themselves that this really happened by telling other people about it. It's very normal behavior. Don't be patient with them. Second, anger. Anger is part of the grieving process. Well, I don't want to be angry, they might miss them. Well, yeah, and that's true and that's good, but maybe be angry at God. Maybe be angry at life. Maybe the time and place you're living in. But anger is part of the process. I've recently heard from a colleague of mine who lost a son in a car wreck, about the same age as my kids. And he's talking about how angry he is that he didn't wear his seatbelt. This could have all been avoided, he says. It's normal to be angry. Number 3, bargaining. You know, the first year I was a pastor, I did 8 funerals in 8 months. I was kind of scared I would always be doing funerals, to tell you the truth. The first funeral was for a teenage boy learning how to ride a motorcycle. Awful, 17 years old. And the fourth one was a 6-year-old boy died of cancer, Scott Massey, and we prayed for that boy. We prayed. And I remember people saying, you know, I'm praying that Scott will be healed, and I'll make him be a preacher if he gets healed. I am a preacher. It is an exciting life. You can't make someone else do this. This is something God calls you to, and it is challenging. You don't do it for someone else. But bargaining, depression, you realize this is the way things are. I thought it wouldn't be like this. And it makes you depressed. But then you go into acceptance that this is the way things are, but I've got some scars in my psyche, some scars on my heart, but God is with me and He can bring me into a new level of living I've never seen. So that brings us to what really is the conclusion of Ruth, the conclusion in grief. Find God, look for and find God in your grieving situation. Your world's changed, but you can still find and know God in that situation. There is the happy ending to the book of Ruth, that Ruth in her faith goes, and in the Old Testament law it says that when you're picking your crops, you're never supposed to pick all your crops, leave some of the crops behind for poor people to be able to get. And so Ruth was a widow, a poor woman, and went and picked crops. This man, Boaz, notices her. If you haven't read the story, the book, I hope you'll maybe read it this afternoon or tomorrow. It's a very short story. It's a very subtle romance, but it's a very powerful romance. Some people read things in the story that's not there. It's not there. If you don't see it, it's not there. But it is interesting. They noticed each other, and they began to just interact with each other. And the next thing you know, they're married. And Ruth and Boaz have a child together. And his name is Obed, and his son was Jesse, and his son was David. This is the great-great-grandmother of King David. God's provision, God's providence is giving right here in the midst of a situation that looks really sad, hopeless, and depressing. God gives us King David out of the situation, and on top of that, Ruth is not a Jew. She is a Moabite. She's from Moab. God has taken a foreigner and grafted it into the line of Israel to give us King David. And more importantly, from King David, Ruth is a way back great grandmother of Jesus. Where it looks like all hope is gone, God is not through. God is working through ordinary people in ordinary situations, and that's just how powerful God is. But our role is to look for God in the grieving situations, and when we look for Him, we'll find Him. I'm going to share a verse with you here about grief and loss from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. This is out of the Message paraphrase, and it says, "And regarding the question, friends, that has come up about what happens to those who are already dead and buried, we don't want you to be in the dark any longer. First of all, you must not carry over them like people who have nothing to look forward to, as if the grave was the last word. Since Jesus died and broke loose from the grave, God will most certainly bring back to life those who died in Jesus." The resurrection power of Jesus is greater than your sadness, your loneliness, your depression, the hurt that comes with a loss. The Lord's power, who broke the bonds of death, can break that sadness, that despair, that futility, that frustration you have in your life, I can have in my life. There's a gentleman in another church whose wife, interesting gentleman, he had been on Governor Wallace's staff for a number of years. Wife, she had Alzheimer's, and she had been totally turned into a blank person. Had no memory. Couldn't even speak. Had lost her memory of speech. It was sad, and I would go see her, and then I would go see him. He was at home. She became too violent to keep in the home and had to be in a nursing home, and it was a hardship, and he and I shared together, and we talked about these things, and we prayed about these things, and it was amazing. Right there in that living room, in that house on the cul-de-sac, the resurrection power of Jesus was supporting this man through a very sad stretch of living. Through a very difficult stretch of living. There wasn't anything I could have brought to the situation other than we were united in Jesus Christ, and Jesus brought power in a situation where there was great sadness. The resurrection power is greater than the sufferings of this life. The prophet Isaiah prophesied that one day would come who would be a descendant of Naomi and Ruth, Jesus. And this is what Isaiah says in Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me because He has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness prisoners, proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all those who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion. Do you see that? 4 groups. The sorrowful, the poor, the brokenhearted, and the imprisoned. All 4 of these, he said, I've got good news for them. I'm there to bind them up and strengthen them, picking back up with the word too, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, an oil of joy instead of mourning, a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of His splendor. What is the work of the coming Messiah? The work of Jesus is that we would be restored, we would be strengthened and brought back. Our challenge is to look for God in our grieving situations. God has more for you than you can dream or imagine or even anticipate. That is how great our Lord is. Grief isn't something we have to run from or hide from. It is something we can openly embrace and engage because God has greater things for each of us ahead. Have you found the Lord in your grief? Have you found the Lord? I would love to pray with you if you haven't, or if you're struggling with this area, as we stand and sing together a great hymn about prayer, Sweet Hour of Prayer. Let's stand and sing together. 496, Sweet Hour of Prayer.